I'm 72 years old, and it took me most of my life to understand that love can still leave you lonely. When I was younger, I thought loneliness was for people who had no one, no wife, no children, no family waiting at home. I thought if love was in your life, then loneliness stayed outside. I was wrong. I had a wife who loved me. I had children who grew up under my roof. I had family dinners, birthdays, holidays, school pictures, noise in the house, and all the ordinary things people point to when they say a man had a good life. And still, I was lonely in the middle of it. Not all at once, not in some dramatic way. It happened so slowly I almost mistook it for normal life. I'm telling you this now because at my age, I don't have much interest left in protecting my pride. When you get old, you start hearing time differently. A missed call feels heavier. An empty evening feels longer. A quiet house can say things out loud that people never did. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy. Sympathy is light. It touches you for a moment and disappears. I'm telling it because I want to say one honest thing before I run out of years. When I was a young man, I believed love meant responsibility. That was what I understood. Work hard, pay the bills, keep food in the house, fix what breaks, be dependable. I thought if I did those things well, then everything deeper would somehow take care of itself. That was the kind of man I became. Not cruel, not wild, not careless, just distant in a way that looked respectable. My father had been that kind of man too. He worked every day. He kept a roof over our heads. He didn't drink much. He didn't disappear, but he wasn't warm. If he loved you, you were expected to know it without hearing it. So that was the example I carried into my own life. I met my wife Helen when I was 26. She was quiet, but not empty. She noticed things, small things, the mood of a room, the look on someone's face, the difference between what people said and what they meant. When she listened to you, you felt like she had made space for you in her mind. I loved that about her. We were not one of those couples people stare at. There was nothing dramatic about us. We were steady, sensible. We looked like the kind of pair that would last, and we did last. But lasting and feeling close are not always the same thing. I know that now. I worked at a supply company. Long hours, plain work, loading docks, invoices, inventory problems, trucks coming in late, orders going out early. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was stable, and stability felt important to me. Helen worked part-time in a library before the children came. After that, she stayed home. We didn't have some long, thoughtful conversation about it. That was just how our life took shape. She cared for the house and the children. I worked. At the time, it all seemed reasonable. That's the thing about many mistakes. They don't look like mistakes when you're living them. They look like duty. They look like maturity. They look like doing the right thing. I missed dinners because work ran late. I missed school events because something came up. I missed long talks in the kitchen because I was tired. And every missed thing had an explanation attached to it. That's what made it easy. Helen would say, "They were hoping you'd be there tonight." And I would say, "I'm doing this for all of you." I said that many times over the years. It sounded responsible. It sounded fair. It let me walk past things I should have stopped for. I never thought of myself as a bad husband. I was faithful. I brought money home. I didn't shout much. I didn't make scenes. I wasn't one of those men who frightened everyone in the house. So I gave myself credit for not being worse. That is a very poor standard to live by, though I didn't know it then. I'd come home after dark and find the children already half asleep or in bed. Helen would leave my dinner in the oven. Sometimes she sat with me while I ate. Sometimes she didn't. If she was quiet, I took that as understanding. I didn't know silence could mean disappointment, getting tired. The children got used to me in pieces. They knew me as the man who left early, came home tired, and promised we'd do something next weekend. Sometimes next weekend came. Often it didn't. There was always something else. Work, repairs, a headache, bills, sleep. I knew practical things about them. I knew shoe sizes. I knew report card dates. I knew what things cost. But there were other things I should have known, and I didn't. I didn't know when my daughter began keeping her feelings to herself. I didn't know when my son stopped waiting for me to come outside and throw a ball with him. I didn't know Helen had started carrying more than her share of the emotional weight in that house. These are not things that happen in one afternoon. They build quietly. That is what makes them dangerous. I remember one night very clearly. My daughter had a school concert. She wasn't the lead. It was not some major event, just one of those evenings that seem small while it's happening and enormous years later. Helen told me about it weeks ahead of time. She reminded me that morning too. I meant to go, but that afternoon something went wrong at work. My manager asked me to stay. I stayed. By the time I got home, the concert was over. The house was quiet except for the sound of dishes in the kitchen. Helen was washing plates that didn't look like they needed washing. I asked how it went. She said, "She kept looking for you." That was it. No fight, no speech, just one sentence. I felt ashamed for a few minutes. Then I ate dinner, got tired, and told myself there would be another concert. That is how people lose what matters. Not always through cruelty. Sometimes just through delay. Through assuming there will be more chances. Years passed like that. The children grew. The house changed. Bigger coats by the door. Later bedtimes. More opinions. Less noise around me because they had learned not to expect much from my attention. Helen changed too, but in smaller ways. She didn't become harsh. She didn't turn cold. She simply stopped asking as much. Stopped reminding me of every little event. Stopped building her hopes around whether I might show up more fully next time. There is a loneliness that comes from being left. But there is another kind that comes from realizing people have adjusted to your absence while you were still standing in the room. By my 40s, I had the kind of life many men wanted. Decent income, stable home, wife still there, children doing all right. If someone had asked me then whether I was lonely, I probably would have laughed. Lonely? With a family? But some nights I would sit in the living room after everyone had gone to bed and feel something hollow I didn't know how to name. The house would be quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen or the pipes moving in the walls. And I'd feel like I was near my life, but not fully inside it. I didn't know how to talk about that. Men of my generation were not taught how to say, "I feel far away from the people I love." We turned pain into tiredness, fear into irritation, longing into silence. So I kept going. People call that strength when a man keeps going. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just habit. Then the children grew up and left. First my son, then my daughter. Later came marriages, grandchildren, visits planned around schedules. By then, work had eased. I had more time, more freedom, more of what I had told myself I was earning all those years. And that is when I discovered something painful. By the time I had more time to give, the shape of our lives had already changed. My daughter loved me, I know she did, but there was a distance in her. She spoke to her mother more openly than she ever spoke to me. My son and I could talk about safe things. The weather, repairs, money, sports. But there was no easy path into the deeper parts. I had not built that when he was young. That doesn't suddenly appear later just because you finally want it. Helen and I entered a quieter stage of marriage. Peaceful, maybe, from the outside. Efficient. We shared a house well. We knew each other's habits. We could predict each other's movements from room to room. She put the kettle on before I asked. I'd lock the doors before bed without thinking. But knowing someone's habits is not the same as knowing their heart. Sometimes we sat together in the evening, and I felt lonely beside her in a way I had never felt in an empty room. That is hard to admit, because it sounds ungrateful. But it was true. She was not cold. She was tired. There's a difference. Years of reaching towards someone who only gives practical love can make a person tired in a place deeper than anger. I think she loved me until the end, maybe more faithfully than I deserved. But love does not always protect people from loneliness, not when closeness has been postponed for too long. The turning point came when Helen got sick. It wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly. Doctor's visits, tests, waiting rooms with bad coffee and old magazines. Quiet drives home where neither of us said much, because speaking made it feel more real. I was there for all of it. I drove her to appointments. I learned the names of medications. I cooked more, cleaned more, stayed home more. Some part of me believed this was my chance to make things right, to show up properly at last. But there are some seasons in life where you cannot repair old absence by becoming useful at the end. One night, near the end, she was lying in bed awake. The room was dim. The lamp on her side was still on. She looked smaller than I was used to seeing her. Fragile, but still very much herself. She said, "You always loved us. I know that." I said, "Of course I did." Then she looked at me and said, "I just wish you had been with us while you were with us." She did not say it with anger. That's what made it harder to bear. It was not an accusation. It was the truth. And at my age, I can tell you this. There are sentences that do not leave a man once he has heard them. I sat there holding her hand and understood, for the first time, the difference between loving people and making them feel accompanied. I had loved them, but too often I had not really stayed with them. Helen died in the fall. After the funeral, people came by the house with food and soft voices and stories. They stood in my kitchen and told me how kind she was, how steady she was, how she remembered small things about them when nobody else did. I listened. I nodded. I thanked them. Then one by one they left, and the house became very quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. I noticed then how much of our family had been held together by her attention. She remembered birthdays. She called people first. She kept track of who was hurting, who needed help, who had not visited in too long. She softened things between people without making a show of it. I had spent years thinking I was holding the family together because I paid for the house they lived in. But Helen had been holding it together in the way that mattered more. After she died, my children called. They visited. They checked on me. They brought groceries. They were kind. But I was not the center of their lives. I was not the person they called first with good news or fear or confusion. I was included. I was respected. I was cared for, but I was not close. That is one of the loneliest places a man can arrive, to be loved and still feel far away. There are things now that cannot be fixed. I cannot go back to that school concert. I cannot return to those dinners and listen properly. I cannot give Helen the missing years of attention she waited for so patiently. I cannot become the father in memory that I failed to be in real time. Time is cruel that way. It doesn't say, "Now that you understand, let us open the door and let you try again." It only moves one way. I still see my children. I still hear from them. I have grandchildren now, and children are generous in ways adults often are not. One of them will sit by my chair and ask me simple questions. What was your first car? Were you ever afraid when you were young? Did Grandma always make soup like this? And for a little while, I feel something soften. But then they go home, and the house returns to itself. The empty chair across from mine. The second cup I no longer set out. the evenings that stretch longer than they used to. And I think about how a man can spend his whole life inside love and still fail to live inside it properly. That is the part I wish I had known sooner. Not as advice, not as some speech from an old man who thinks age has made him important, just as truth. Love does not always arrive in another person just because you feel it strongly inside yourself. It has to reach them. Sometimes that means giving time when time feels expensive. Sometimes it means listening when you are tired. Sometimes it means putting down whatever seems urgent and sitting still long enough for someone else to feel that they matter more than your worries. I used to think duty was the proof of love. Now I think presence was the part I misunderstood. A paycheck matters. A safe home matters. I am not foolish enough to pretend those things don't count. They do. Hunger and fear can make tenderness difficult, but people do not remember your usefulness in the way you imagine they will. They remember how it felt to be near you. That stays, or the lack of it stays. Helen has been gone 5 years. Sometimes I still speak to her in the kitchen while the kettle is boiling. Not because I think she'll answer, just because some habits of love don't leave when the person does. And I still hear that sentence, "I just wish you had been with us while you were with us." There is no answer to that sentence, no defense, no explanation worth offering once a thing is already true. I do not hate the man I was. He was trying. He was afraid of failure. He thought being a good man meant being dependable and not asking for much. He did what he had seen done before him, but he was absent in ways that looked honorable. And that kind of absence can ruin the warmth of a life without making any noise. If this means something to you, maybe it is because you know some part of it already. Maybe you have felt distance growing in a room where nobody was openly unkind. Maybe you have been loved by someone who never fully arrived. Maybe you have done that to someone yourself. I don't say that to wound you. I say it because life is shorter than it feels while you are busy living it. At 72, I don't have a grand ending to offer. Old age takes the shine off grand endings. Most lives do not tie themselves up neatly. They continue in ordinary ways until one day they stop. I still wake up. I still make tea. I still fold my shirts and forget things at the store and sit in the yard when the weather is mild. I still feel grateful sometimes in ways so sharp they almost hurt. And I still feel lonely in a way I once thought only belonged to people who had no one. That was the part I learned too late. Love can leave you lonely. Not because it was fake, not because no one cared, but because care, when left unspoken or unlived, can grow thin over time. And by the time you finally feel the cold of it, the years you needed are already gone. I loved them. I loved my wife. I loved my children. I love them still. But too often I gave my best presents to work, worry, and tiredness, and left the people I loved with whatever was left. That is how a man grows old in a house once full of love, and still finds himself listening to the silence. And that is how I learned, too late, that love can leave you lonely.